All right, hi everyone, I'm Liz. I run Course Report, which is a resource for choosing the right bootcamp for you. This is my one shameless plug. I do it in all of our videos, but you can use Course Report to research the best coding bootcamps, the best data science bootcamps all over the world. And as you're researching those bootcamps, I'm willing to bet that you will come across SQL. So SQL is a technology that you will arguably need to use no matter what job you get in tech. So we want to do a primer on SQL. And who better to help me than our guest today, Jonathan Balaban. Thank you for joining us. Jonathan is an instructor at Metis, which is a data science bootcamp in New York, Chicago. Jonathan, where else are y'all? Y'all are all over the country.
Yeah, we're in New York, Chicago, Seattle, and San Francisco.
Amazing. And online as well, because they actually teach a new SQL fundamentals class online. So Jonathan, I cannot wait to pick your brain about this. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
And we're gonna show some slides as we go so that you can follow along, and I will post those slides after this, after we wrap up. I'll also post the video and the transcript on our blog afterwards, so you can follow along. Okay, all right, let's get started. So Jonathan, let's just start with you, I guess. You're a senior instructor at Metis, but you've also worked as a data scientist before. You have a pretty rich career in data science. Could you just tell us about your background and how long you've been in data science and a part of this little world?
All right, yes. So I graduated from college in a time before the term data science was coined. I think it was kind of fortunate in that I studied something that overlapped quite well with what would become the field of data science. And that's operations research, or some schools call it industrial systems engineering. So there was a lot of emphasis on things like distributions and probabilities and pure math and algorithms, and a pretty good exposure to a number of different programming languages, including SQL. And I think when I was in school, little did I realize exactly how much SQL I would be using over the course of my life. So after I graduated, I jumped into consulting, and I started more in the public sector with a focus on like defense and international government work. After a while at Booz Allen Hamilton, a pretty well-known consulting firm, I jumped into McKinsey & Company. I was there for a short time doing more strategy-focused work. Then I had my own consultancy for 2.5, 3 years. Technically, I still have it just as an independent consulting. During that time, I started teaching like evening part-time courses. I didn't even know that it was possible to sort of like teach these courses and get involved in sort of this new modern educational space. So learning about it, I was like, wow, this is fantastic. I kind of wish this was around when I was in school, because I would have really enjoyed like the accelerated rate of learning and the way that things are really hands-on. And you know, my academic program was an awesome one, but it wasn't very tied to like real world data. So I had to kind of relearn a lot of things on the job. So I joined Metis 2 years ago, and we basically had a focus on the immersive bootcamp program. That is a 3-month data science immersive program, as mentioned, in New York, Chicago, Seattle, and San Francisco. But we're increasingly building out live online courses. And among the many that we offer is SQL fundamentals. And I was fortunate enough to be basically the creator of the curriculum for that. So it's really exciting to like be here and be able to share about that and the motivation behind how and why that was built.
Amazing. Well, as the creator of that course, we're lucky to have you, and obviously future data scientists are lucky to have you at Metis. So I know you've been working on that new SQL class, so let's kind of dive into what SQL is. So for total beginners, we're going to kind of focus this conversation on total beginners. Tell us what SQL is and what it's used for.
Absolutely, and that's really the motivation behind the course itself. So we call it SQL Fundamentals because there is no requirement to have ever used or touched SQL before you sign up for this course. So SQL is an acronym that stands for Structured Query Language. And I think the two things I'd like to highlight here, because names have a lot of meaning, where they often do, is structured. So we're talking about data that is structured in a specific type of format, which is called a relational database. And then query is another fancy word for searching or pulling. Pulling like the things that matter to you or to your company out of that huge data set, and being able to do like further analysis or making smarter decisions with it. So with SQL, this language, we can basically interact with a relational database to, as highlighted in the second bullet here, manage the data. So we can like insert new data in. We can modify data that we've inserted in last week. We can delete data if it doesn't make sense to store it any longer. We can do any number of like simple to complex queries or searches for the specific observations or rows of data that we're interested in. We can combine it in any number of ways. And then of course, after we do that, we can then analyze things. We can create graphs, reports, etc., to make better informed decisions. And finally, just a little bit of history. We're going to jump into the origins of SQL on the next slide. But it's been basically a standard, an ANSI standard since 1986, and an ISO standard since '87. So that seems quite old. Actually, the origins go back into the early '70s. But it's a language that has been around for quite a while. And even in 2018, when everything is sort of modern and new and a lot of old stuff has died along the way, SQL is very much alive and strong and in use in all the most fancy tech companies you can imagine.
Yeah, that was one of the things that surprised me the most, was seeing the year 1970. Cannot believe that SQL has lasted that long. But could you just talk a little bit more about like the origins of SQL and who these nice looking men are?
Yes. So the gentleman on the left, his name is Ted Codd. He was an English research scientist. He was working at IBM. Back in the 70s, everybody was working at IBM, I think half the world. So IBM was a real powerhouse in terms of information and development and like new technologies. So he came up with this concept of a relational database, or a way to store data in such a way that you don't just dump everything into one table, but rather you have like an organized way to have like different types of data in different smaller tables. Well, the question is, okay, we've sort of split these data points into different rooms. How can they talk to each other? Well, we can sort of wire up a system by which they can relate to each other. So, data in a specific table might actually be related or connected to another table via use of keys. The keys are basically things that say these guys are related. This relational database does a number of things. It allows scalability, which is huge because every decade, starting in the 70s, but even before then, especially now, we're collecting orders of magnitude more data. So there's just so much data being generated. Matter of fact, a lot of studies are showing that in like the last 5 years, more data has been created than all the data that existed from the beginning of recorded time up until 5 years ago. And that's going to continue. So
seems believable and insane.
Yeah, it really is insane that pattern is going to keep continuing. So databases and ways to sort of interact with and extract data are essential for really any company. So Ted Codd developed the system, and then two other folks, the guys to the right are first, in the middle we have Donald Chamberlain, and on the right we have Raymond Boyce. And these guys were Americans, and they basically got together and said, we need to create like a pretty simple language where we can quickly and easily interact with these relational databases and pull the data out. Because it used to be just a very manual thing where people had to like match up the keys, and it was tedious and painful. And the relational model really came into its fore, and people adopted it once SQL existed, because it allowed them to easily communicate. And for those in the audience that are thinking, I don't know any programming languages, and I'm kind of concerned because it seems like black magic, something that I can't wrap my head around. SQL is about as easy as it gets of a language to get started. So I really can't think of anything that's more simple and almost like English language in the way that it's approached.
Yeah, it seems like in data science, especially, there are concepts that get very complicated, machine learning, things that you kind of need to know a programming language before you step into and specialize in. But that SQL is actually something that you can do before, or learn before you even like jump into your first programming language, which is really cool.
The learning curve is super fast. So by the end of like the first 3-hour module that we have in our course, you're already doing, basic SQL queries and modifying data. Anybody can do it.
Cool. Okay, so SQL has been around forever, even before like data science, web developer, before those were jobs that you could apply to, it seems like. And I see SQL popping up at so many different types of boot camps, web development boot camps, data science boot camps. Could you talk a little bit about the ways that SQL is used across tech and not maybe just in data science?
Yeah, so let's take this bullet by bullet here. How does SQL interact with web development?
Mm-hmm.
Well, websites back in the 90s, if you can remember, they used to be these static pages where you had some text and somebody posted a picture of something, and that was really it. You would just go to a website and read things. And then we started introducing more like multimedia, but also introducing more interactivity with websites, where now they can ask you questions or they can be customized, based on how you're filling out a form, things like that. So SQL is the mechanism, or relational databases are often the mechanism by which website managers are able to capture all the data that users are inputting into their site, whether it's like people filling out a form, or whether it's people actually clicking on a button or different events. And there are a number of technologies out there. SQL is definitely not the only way to interact, but a lot of these databases are relational databases. And SQL is the way that we can pull the actions, the events that happen on a website and store it in a database. Where you can do things kind of like Google Analytics, where you can figure out, hey, how many people clicked on this button, or who exactly clicked on this button, and did they buy our product or not? And think about those bigger business questions. Now, it works even more so on the other side. If you're going on Amazon.com and you're taking a look at different products, well, the price of that product changes. I don't know, have you ever shopped on Amazon or somewhere and the price kind of changes depending on which day of the week you're looking at it? So there's a database, of course, that stores the price of that product and if it's available, or how many are in inventory. Or the dimensions of the box, and how much the box might weigh. And all those things are kind of essential in terms of like e-commerce. So SQL is the mechanism by which a lot of these things get pulled out of a database and can then get populated into a website.
So web development, we know that SQL is used in data engineering and kind of like data science. Are there SQL developers, this was my question, are there like SQL developers who are just using SQL, like that is their sole job?
Yes, definitely. So let me table that one, and I'll go through the data engineering and business analysts real quick, just to provide a little context there, because yeah, it may seem obvious to us, but in data engineering, basically, your job, the way I would describe a data engineer in one sentence, is you need to build all the piping inside of a company where you can capture, transform, and store data correctly so that the analysts and other people can actually pull it when they need and like use it. So of course, data engineers need to understand SQL. Like the stuff that's getting sent through the piping is the data, and the way that it's manipulated and managed is SQL is going to be your language, among others, of course, depending on which company you're with. A business analyst. Certain companies, if you're a business analyst, you might not need to know SQL at all, because you can email someone, like the help desk or something, and say, hey, can you pull this specific set of data? But Liz, the reality is that sometimes you send that email and nobody responds for like 5 or 10 days. And you could just sit there and say, I can't do my job, or I'm going to fail at my task that my manager asked me to do because I don't know SQL. Or you could learn SQL and empower yourself to actually go into the system, of course, if you're allowed to do so, and just pull that data yourself. And when you have the, when you have the autonomy and the independence to be able to do that, usually like if you do it wrong, you can go back right away and fix it and figure out what happened. If you're relying on somebody else, there's this whole bottleneck that you're waiting on, and it really slows things down. So whenever we did consulting, sometimes we had to depend on people to run SQL scripts for us. But whenever we had direct access to databases, things always went so much more smoothly because we could just pull and modify and realize that we need to actually pull more data, older data, etc. And then to your last question on the SQL developers, there are definitely people whose job title is SQL developer, and these people are highly focused on generally data engineering or data architecture work, and you will find a lot of SQL developers with companies like Oracle or Microsoft, and these are companies that actually have platforms or services that are built around relational models. So, you couldn't take the SQL fundamentals class and then become a SQL developer and do advanced work, but it could be the first step in a series of steps that gets you there. These are really high-paying jobs because it takes attention to detail, and it takes somebody that really understands the nuances of databases, and that's an in-demand skill.
For sure. Okay, thank you for not letting me gloss over those, because that was actually very interesting and nice to kind of understand what those roles actually mean. Okay, cool. So SQL is used obviously in a bunch of different tech roles, but for the rest of this conversation, we're just going to focus on SQL kind of as it fits into data science. So I've heard you use this term, relational database, a bunch of times already. Could you walk us through an example of a database?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we go to the next slide here, and I've got animation built in, so there we go.
Oh, okay.
So we're slowly.
So
at the top, that cylinder is basically like the symbol for a database because it looks like a spinning, like magnetic disk drive. And if you've got a rideshare company that you're working at, think Uber, Lyft, whatever country you're watching this in, I'm sure you probably have some rideshare service. Imagine how you would want to capture that data. That's probably the best way to take a relational database and make it real for us. So you can hit the next button there. You would definitely want to capture information about the rides, like where it started, where it ended, when it happened, maybe how much it cost, things like that, right? But of course, there's more to the context of what exactly is happening. And so a relational database can sort of split up this next section, which is drivers. So we've got a pool of drivers, maybe 1,000, maybe 10,000 people. And we need to store things like their driver's license, when their driver's license expires, so that we can send an email and say, hey, you need to send us a picture of your new license. We can also capture things like their rating out of 5 stars, how many rides they've given, how much money they've made over time, and maybe there's some incentive with like if you hit 100 rides or if you hit a certain milestone. And then with the next table that we create here, it can be passenger information. So in Uber and Lyft and others, drivers have ratings, but so do passengers. And so this interaction between a person who is offering a ride and a person who is taking a ride creates this thing called a ride. But we can split that up into different categories and store those into tables. And when we do that, we can actually use a whole lot less space and memory to manage that data. But that's where we need SQL to make these tables talk to each other. So we can connect a ride to a driver and a passenger through something like an ID or a username or something.
Cool. Okay, Jonathan, can I ask a question that as a beginner, I see all the time, but as somebody who's experienced with SQL, this may be just the silliest question. But what are these new kind of database languages like MySQL, NoSQL? Are these types of SQL? Are they alternatives to SQL? What's kind of the difference there if we see that in a curriculum?
Yeah, so SQL is a standard language that's kind of the development of it, or like adding new terms, like new methods and definitions, is sort of standardized. But you have these different flavors or variants of it. And MySQL is just one of a number. So there's Postgres, there's MySQL. Those are some of the most common ones. MySQL is just a platform. So you can download their software, or it can run within a console or a shell also. And it's basically the SQL language plus a little bit of additional spice. Like it can do a couple of extra cool things. NoSQL is more of a methodology than a company or a like specific package, and it stands for not only SQL. And I think this is a case study in bad branding, because when people read NoSQL, they're like, oh, so I won't have to use SQL. This is something that's going to take its place. It's not only SQL, which means SQL is really the core of NoSQL database languages. But in addition to that, they've added on some cool functionality for the internet age, because like the scale of data is bigger than ever before. And we can actually take databases and go away from relational databases into like more loosely structured databases, and use SQL and other things to combine the data.
As data changes, databases change, obviously the web changes. You mentioned before, I mean, SQL was developed in the 70s, and I actually just read a blog post that that you were featured in recently. I'll post the link to it, kind of about this. But why do you think that SQL has lasted throughout the years and not just been like totally replaced by a new querying language?
I think because it's super intuitive. So other languages have been replaced over time, or if not completely, they've sort of died down in popularity as something like better and faster has taken its place. But SQL is very simple, and it's very focused on doing a few things really well. And so, you know, there's always the question, hey, is it going to be dead in like 5 or 10 years? If it is, I mean, I doubt it, but if it is, that's still a long time to be able to sort of like empower yourself. And even if it was dying in a year or two, like I said earlier, I think it's one of the best languages for a person that is new to computer science and programming to get started. It's simple. You can interact with a basic database. You don't need any fancy computers or connections or anything. And it's a really quick way to get started doing things and seeing the results right away. So it's cool.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, because I feel like I talked to a lot of people who took a data science boot camp, because we talked to a ton of alumni. They started off like loving Excel, but then kind of hitting a wall with it, and then started to look into SQL, and that was kind of their gateway into much, you know, kind of like deeper languages. But so I know that specific type of person who could easily pick up SQL, but could you talk about what other types of people are like made to start doing SQL? What kinds of people are good at that?
For my specific course, or Metis' specific course, again, there is no requirement for knowing SQL, but there may be a lot of people that have used it in the past, but it's been a while. It's a great refresher. It's actually something that I would recommend to a subset of my bootcamp students. So we actually teach SQL in the bootcamp, but we don't have a lot of time because we're covering a whole lot of 3 months. And so this is like a bit of a deeper dive. There's some overlap or a little bit of repetition at the beginning, but that's okay. Just like reinforcing these skills that need some repetition. And then they can get into like deeper SQL and reinforce those skills. And a lot of times they see questions being asked of them in interviews, like, can you write a SQL script that'll do this? Or, you know, it's a great language for those like quick checks of people's skills. Other folks, anybody that's using Excel, like if you're using Excel extensively and you're making pivot tables, or you're using Visual Basic or VBA, create macros and automating, combining tables of data on different worksheets. SQL is just like an intuitive or natural evolution of that. It's a great next step. There's millions of people that are using Excel. But even if it's not Excel, maybe it's Salesforce, or maybe it's some other platforms where you've got sort of these data sets with different records of people's, things, products, etc. And you want to be able to work at, in a sense, a higher level, but also a lower level, because SQL has less overhead than these platforms. It's really scalable and fast, but it's it's a language, so you can customize it much more than you could with something like Excel. With Excel, you're potentially limited to like whatever Microsoft allows you to run, in terms of their built-in functions and things. Yeah.
Okay, and then you mentioned interviews. So I want to make sure we talk about this. What are some companies that use SQL? Like, is this every company, every tech company you can expect to use SQL? Is there a type of tech company that uses SQL?
Facebook, big user of SQL. They actually created their own variant of SQL. It's called Hive. Microsoft, of course, all of their platforms internally run on their own technologies, which is SQL Server. Like they serve themselves with their own SQL-based platforms. Google's cloud is really centered around SQL. There's other technologies that play too, just like I mentioned, with the proliferation of the internet. New technologies had to come in to sort of like help complement SQL, but SQL still definitely at the core of a lot of that. So, I would flip the question, like, which tech companies would not use SQL? And I'd put my money on you not being able to find one unless it's like a really small startup and it bought into like one specific little package. But if it gets big enough, somebody's going to use SQL somewhere. And, anytime you've got a lot of data, you're going to see SQL.
Cool. All right. Okay. So throughout this whole conversation, I feel like we have been talking about how beginner-friendly SQL is. Metis has this new SQL class. How deep do y'all go into the curriculum in that class? How much deeper than this 20-minute conversation will you get?
Way deeper than this. We haven't actually looked at code. I hope you're ready. I'm just kidding. So it's a 12-hour program, and we fill it pretty well. But again, the idea is it's accessible to everybody, as long as you have the concept of like what a database is in general, and you've never played with data before, and it's more based on motivation. Hey, do you have the motivation and the grit to like stick through this? Because we're going to start at a low bar, but we're going to move quite quickly, cover a number of things in 12 hours. And with that, like, you can turn around and start, using this stuff. It depends on the job, of course, but a lot of people can start utilizing this right away on the job to reinforce those skills.
If they, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, the students that we're really looking for here are the ones that sort of exemplify or have these 4 criteria. Whether it's a beginner and you're going to be using it a little bit, or whether you want to make a career out of it, you need some grit, because it's not, it's not the prettiest language in the world. It's not the funnest thing in the world, but that's why people get paid so much to do it, because it's a skill that is in demand. There's more demand than there is supply. Curiosity about the database, so that you like really understand how things relate to each other and what's where, and kind of knowing the lay of the land. Creativity, especially when you get into like intermediate and advanced. And I would say that our class gets up to like beginner intermediate. So it's all beginner, and then it starts touching into some intermediate concepts. But above and beyond that, especially, you can get really creative. So it's not a really broad language, but you can do some really cool things with the limited methods that you have available. And then attention to detail is really important, because you need to like have a keen eye for like syntax and making sure that the data that you pulled is correct. And also just little things like being careful, backing up your data. And we emphasize these things and show you how to do it. But you don't want to go to your company and play around with SQL and like delete all the data. That would be bad. So attention to detail is an important skill set for success.
Cool. I feel like I want to take this class. Okay, so let's talk about the curriculum a little bit. What will go into those 12 hours? And yeah, how deep do y'all get into SQL and the curriculum?
Okay, so these are the things we basically cover. Creating and managing tables, that's the first step because you need a place to store some data. We actually use 2 real-world data sets. One is on soccer tournaments and matches that have been played. The other is on tennis data. And you know, some potential students might think, I don't work at like a sports company, so how does this apply to me? Well, actually, I selected these data sets because they have a lot of characteristics very similar to a lot of business cases. And in the class, we have opportunities to sort of talk about how this might apply to a specific company, especially if you can sort of share details about what your data looks like. You know, from there we go into queries, which is just pulling the subset of data that we want, joining it. So like joining things from one table to things from another table, and you can extend that to joining things from many, many tables in a sophisticated manner. Subqueries, which is like nesting queries inside of each other. Sets, which is pulling like deduplicated lists of things where there's no like duplicates or overlaps. Functions, which is fun. You can do a number of like math transformations and calculations, and you can do it right in SQL. So you can like create metrics and things right there before you do any reporting. And then advanced data management, including like best practices in terms of like designing database, also changing permissions. So like turning off permissions for me because I deleted the company's data last week, so only you now have access to it, and I can only read it, but you can write and execute code against it. So things like that, we get into that.
Cool. Okay, so we know that SQL is relatively beginner friendly. This course actually sounds, I mean, there are some big words in here and, you know, we're working with data, but like it does sound pretty beginner friendly. If somebody isn't like quite ready to jump into the SQL fundamentals class, but just wants to kind of like get their toes wet, what do you suggest? What are some learning resources that you really like right now?
Yeah, so I guess we'll go bottom up with this one and end with Metis. If you want like a really low threshold introduction, Khan Academy is always great. I've refreshed on a number of math concepts with Khan Academy. I've actually showed my kids different videos. And they have a nice like basic intro to SQL. Codecademy has like interactive capabilities, which is fun to play around with. And so does W3 Schools. So they host like little mini data sets, and you can play around with things, pulling data. As mentioned, we teach SQL at our data science immersive bootcamp, and that is actually incorporated more tightly within data science. So it's like SQL within the context of machine learning and building these different models and pulling data intelligently from databases. My students are currently in the current bootcamp that I'm teaching. They're taking data from different online repositories, and they're hosting it in their own databases, and they're pulling it as needed as they're fitting their machine learning models, which is really cool. And then, of course, finally, we have that 12-hour SQL fundamentals course you can do before you dive into a bootcamp. After, maybe it's like 6 months after and you want to do a refresher, or if you have no interest at all in getting into data science, but you just want to be more empowered in terms of pulling and playing with your own data.
Okay, so it's 12 hours long, it's online. Is it self-guided, or do you need to be there or start at a certain day?
So it's live online, so you're going to have an instructor, and you'll likely have a TA also that's kind of like supporting the class. And basically the instructor is going to be teaching different concepts for maybe the first half of each class. And then the second half is like a hands-on playing around with the data. So all the things that we learned theoretically and we saw examples of how it's done, we now are able to apply it to our soccer and our tennis data sets, and hopefully soon apply it to like real business data. Love it.
That sounds so cool. Well, Jonathan, this was like the perfect primer to SQL, and I feel like people have some free resources to start with. They've got the SQL Fundamentals class, and then they love it, the Data Science Immersive. So such a great path. Anything that we did not cover about SQL that you want to make sure our readers and viewers know about?
No, I think we covered it. Liz, thank you for speaking with me about this. I'm excited about it. I'm very proud of what we put together, and we've already seen success. We've had a number of cohorts, groups of students go through, and the feedback has been really positive, and it's really quickly empowered them to go next level in their careers.
I love it. Well, thank you. I feel like I've learned a lot. I think I'm kind of like one of those people who like uses Excel and kind of hits walls with Excel sometimes. So maybe I'll do this SQL class. That was a great primer. If folks want to learn more about SQL, like I said before, you know, SQL is a part of any good bootcamp's curriculum, but specifically, you can check out Metis' new SQL Fundamentals class. We'll put a link to that when we post this on our blog. And thank you for watching. Let us know in the comments if you have any questions about SQL. And also let us know if there is a topic that you are seeing as you're researching bootcamps, which you would like a primer on. And we will certainly do it. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.